When our country was first founded, we didn't know what to do with people with mental illnesses. So what would happen is loved ones would take their family member with serious mental illnesses and drop them off at the local jail, unless they were wealthy and had means to bring in someone to help watch them or care for them. And it actually remained that way until the early 1800s, when a wonderful woman by the name of Dorothea Dix was visiting a Boston jail, and she came across a group of 14 men who were literally freezing to death. So she went to see the jailer afterwards, and she said to him, like, who are these men? Why are they here, and why are you treating them this way? And his response was, they're not here on charges. I'm not getting paid for them. What do you want me to do? And this one woman, this one person, was so outraged at what she saw, she began a movement called, ironically, moral treatment. And the idea was to take people from these really horrible jails and put them in, and she was really forward-thinking because there was no Freud, there was no medication, there was no psychiatry. But she realized that they should be put in, I shouldn't say they, people with mental illnesses should be put in small hospital settings, no larger than 120 beds, because it's a tough population. You don't want to have too many people there. It'd be easier to manage, and they could be treated more humanely. And by 1900, every state in the country had a psychiatric hospital. Now the problem began is the states. They really haven't changed in a lot of ways at certain fundamentals. And one way is money. And so what they realized is that, you know, we have thousands of people with mental illness in our state, so how can we have 10, 20, 30 small 120-bed facilities? It's inefficient, it's very expensive, it's costly. So you know what, we're going to consolidate our hospital beds. And they rounded them up, and they closed the little ones down, and they started to build these big, massive state hospitals. And I think in Ohio they had a facility that had like 10,000 patients. And the problem was there was no oversight, there was no real treatment, there was no medication, and nobody was watching what was going on. And they became these houses of horror. They became these human experimentation facilities. They started doing very rudimentary medical testing. And they found that, you know, we're talking early 1900s, they found that a lot of people with mental illnesses had slightly elevated blood sugar levels. So there was this assumption that, you know what, they all must be a bunch of diabetics. And so if we give them insulin shock, we give them big insulin shots and we shock them, we can shock them back into sanity. Well, of course they're not diabetics. It didn't work. A lot of people got sick and some people died, and they said, okay, that experiment we're going to finish. And they said, you know what, maybe we can just shock them back into sanity. So they started using electric shock therapy without any treatment, without any science, and a whole bunch more people got killed or were injured horrifically, not to mention traumatized. And then when all failed, what they did is they just cut a piece of the brain out and they did a lobotomy, and this is how they controlled people that they termed were unruly. As we got into the 1960s, there was certain enlightenment, I think, that went on as a result of the 60s. Some crazy stuff, but some good stuff too. And one of the good things that came out of the 60s is that, you know, why are we treating people with mental illnesses this way? And so in what became his last public bill signing, in 1963, President Kennedy signed a $3 billion authorizing act that would have created this wonderful national network of community mental health facilities, because his sister had been lobotomized. He was very sensitive to the issue. And the first medications had come out. Thorazine came out in the late 1950s. And so the idea was that you take people from these horrible houses of horror, you put them in these small community settings, you give them Thorazine, and you case manage them, and we could all live happily ever after. Well, sadly and tragically, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny of the $3 billion ever got appropriated. It was authorized, not appropriated. Well, at the same time, there was a slew of federal lawsuits filed, primarily because of the condition of these facilities. And the first case, the seminal case that led to what we have today, is a case called Wyatt v. Stuckney, and it's a fascinating case in jurisprudence. It was initially and ironically filed by the staff and doctors of the hospital. It had very little to do initially with the condition of the place. What happened was, in Alabama, they decided they were going to significantly cut the cigarette tax. And the cigarette tax was going to fund the state hospital system. And so the doctors and the staff freaked out that when they saw the tax was going to get cut, they'd lose their jobs. And their lawyers must have said to them, you know, unfortunately, you're probably going to have a hard time getting into federal court. So let's do a second part of the pleading. And in the second part of the pleading, it's kind of funny. It says, by the way, the conditions here aren't all that great to begin with. And if we get cut and we're gone, it's going to even be worse. Well, the case ends up in front of this brilliant jurist, Judge Johnson. And this is the same judge, you have to understand, that freed Martin Luther King in Alabama. So he's a very thoughtful, progressive man. The case comes in front of Judge Johnson. He takes a look at it, and the first thing he says is, I'm really sorry, but I have no jurisdiction to tell Alabama who to hire and fire. So on the first part of your pleading, you're SOL. However, he says, and he looks at the second part of the pleading, and he reaches in and he grabs jurisdiction. And he's like, and his language is beautiful, I'm mortified, I'm horrified at the condition of your facility. It's clear they were looking for a case. And he ends up writing this fascinating opinion. And a little tragically, because of lack of information back then, he ends up focusing his entire solution on the physical plant, not on the treatment of the population. And the reason I say it's tragic is because that's the expensive way to go. And so he actually lists 80 conditions, 80 specific things that the state of Alabama has to do to this hospital. In the second part of his opinion, he says, if you don't make all these changes, he threatens them. And he says, I'm going to shut down your hospital, and you're going to have to provide community treatment right there. He was trying to scare them into fixing the hospital, because who would want all those people running around their community, right? So he figured that if he threatened them, they would do it. And they actually began. And like I said, they made some significant changes. Well, Alabama runs out of money, okay, and they stop. Well, Judge Johnson's not someone to goof with. You didn't meet my order. He shut him down. Case is now appealed. It's in front of the United States Supreme Court. And for the most part, the case is affirmed. And so there is a shockwave through the nation. Because if you have a state hospital now, you have to meet these 80 conditions. That's the law. And so nobody wants to do it. So the states have two choices. They could spend the billions of dollars and upgrade their facilities and start to treat this population more humanely and appropriately, or they could shut down and provide community-based treatment. Remember, however, President Kennedy's act is not funded to absorb the population into a community system, so the states have to do it. And they do it very poorly, and they do it on the cheap. When they begin to create these community mental health systems, the people with the highest acuity, who are the most sick, are still in the hospitals. And so the community systems that they actually create in our communities were never set up to handle people that are that sick. But what happened is you have this horrible cost shift going on now, because the states kept closing the hospitals, and sicker people kept going out into the community with less and less resources. And and then the laws started to change, and we had all these sentencing guideline changes, and we started to criminalize these individuals' mental illness. There's about 2 million arrests a year of people with mental illnesses, but there's some duplication. So it's between 1 and 1.5 million people. And there's about 40,000 hospital beds left. There's about 400,000 people in jail and prisons today with serious mental illness. There's another 1.5 million on probation, okay? And so the two horrible ironies here is that, number one is we never deinstitutionalized. What we in fact did is we call it trans-institutionalization. We transferred people from these really bad, horrible, I shouldn't say this on video, but crappy hospitals to really bad, horrible, crappy jails. And the problem is that by giving them a criminal record, we've made it much, much more difficult for them to recover, because they now not only have the discrimination or stigma of mental illness, they have the stigma of being a criminal, and it's harder to get housing, it's harder to get employment, and there's a greater likelihood now that they're going to continue to recycle through the criminal justice system. So there's your history. It's ugly. It is the one area in civil rights in this country we've gone backwards on. It's the only area we've gone backwards on. And it speaks, unfortunately, more about us as a society than it does about people who are truly sick.